Is there any point in making old sounding music? So for the past 10, 20 years, since I've started listening to music more actively, I've noticed that there's been loads of really huge artists that have made music very much inspired by artists from a previous generation. And I've only just started wondering recently, in the last few years, because I make that kind of music as well, whether this is a good thing. Is it lazy? Should we be more experimental, making more modern sounds? We're going to talk about that today. Firstly, let's start with the cons of making old sounding music. We've heard it all before. The Beatles were amazing, Motown was amazing, but the 60s they're over now. And if you want to go listen to Motown or the Beatles, you can very easily do that. If those songs and that sound is available, why, in theory, do we need to make more songs that sound like that? Which kind of brings me on to the next point, which is that whenever you imitate something, you inevitably water it down. It will inevitably be a pale imitation of the original. We'll never be able to recreate what was going on in Detroit for Motown in the 1960s or Liverpool in the 1950s, 1960s when the Beatles were writing songs. If we're trying to write in that style, we will inevitably fail. We don't really know what was going on. This is 60 years ago, and we can't capture that spirit and that feeling that they were experiencing at the time. We're not really using our own spirit and the feeling of the 2020s that's going on now. We're kind of ignoring that and trying to recapture something that was 60 years ago, which feels maybe like a waste of time. The final reason I can think of for why this is not a good thing to be doing is when you make a record that sounds like it's from the 1960s or the 1970s, you're inevitably going to be catering to people who recognize that music. So you're catering to people who are older, which is not necessarily a bad thing because older audiences deserve new music as well, but you're kind of completely ignoring a newer audience who don't really have any relation to a horn section or, you know, a disco beat or things like that necessarily. Should you really just be focusing so narrowly on an older market when there's all these newer, younger generations who you're maybe ignoring by making something that's so vintage? So now let's talk about the pros of making old sounding music. A famous producer once said to me, a song is like a chicken breast. The genre that the song is in is like the seasoning. So you can do loads of things to a chicken breast. You can season it with salt and pepper, you can put whatever sauce you want on it, but really at the end of the day, it's still the same chicken breast. And that's the same with a song. If you write an amazing song, you could do loads of stuff to it. You could put a retro kind of beat underneath it, or you can put a trap beat underneath it. It doesn't really matter because the song is really what people hear. The genre is just like the thing that maybe gets them interested, but the song is what they fall in love with. So that would mean that as long as you're writing a song that you feel is really strong, maybe it doesn't matter if you want to put a retro beat underneath it because it's all about the song and the emotion that you're telling, and the rest is just decoration. The next point is that all art is in some way an imitation of another piece of art. There's no real new sounds, you could argue. When people do something revolutionary, it's usually when they blend two contrasting sounds together. And the same could be true with making old music. You can make old sounding music as long as you're approaching it in a modern or a different, fresh way. You could be making something that no one's ever made before. I'm thinking of someone like Amy Winehouse. She's obviously really inspired by 1960s and, you know, jazz and soul from that era. She was also singing about modern topics like drugs and sex and alcohol, which you wouldn't necessarily have talked about as much in the 1960s because things were a bit more taboo back then perhaps. That made, I think, her records really special because it had like the decoration or the dressing of something like kind of vintage, but it was like a modern voice coming through. Which brings me on to my next point, which is that someone like Amy Winehouse, for example, would be introducing older music to a new audience. People her age were relating to lyrics that she was saying and her songs, and they would in turn go and discover the songs and the music that inspired Amy Winehouse, which is great because it keeps older music alive for a new generation, which can be no bad thing. And finally, the last thing I can think about is freedom of expression. I don't think we should ever be saying to people, you shouldn't make that type of music. Inspiration is a really special thing. If someone feels compelled to make a vintage record, they should do it because you never know what's going to come out of it. So I want to give some examples of when I think making old sounding music has worked. Obviously, I talked about Amy Winehouse already because I think she's brilliant. Bruno Major was actually the first one that came to my mind. He's a brilliant guitarist, songwriter who makes very jazz-inspired songs, quite traditional, kind of Cole Porter-y sounding stuff almost. What I think makes it really special and work is the production, because it's got this like lo-fi electronic sound mixed in with the kind of jazzy, like guitar-y thing. I'm not explaining it very well, but I think he worked with this other producer called Fyro. Yeah, obviously they came together and like that made that sound, which when I heard it, I thought I'd never heard anything like this. It doesn't just sound derivative, it sounds like fresh and like a lovely mix of two styles, which I think works so well. So I think he's fantastic. Another one that everyone's talking about at the moment is Olivia Dean, because I think she just won a Grammy for Best New Artist. And I think she's just an example of someone with classic songwriting, great voice, classic arrangement, and I don't think there's anything like production-wise that is that unusual going on, but I think everything is just done to such a high standard. So the last one that comes to mind, and there's obviously so many vintage-inspired music out there that I love. Sam Smith's first two albums, I absolutely love them. They're obviously kind of inspired by this 60s soul Motown thing that I love. You could also tell that there's modernity in like the production. I'm thinking about stuff like Money on My Mind and other stuff in the first album like Life Support. There was a mixture of modern techniques with this old classic sound, and obviously the voice is ridiculous. Now it's time for my take. Obviously, being someone who makes vintage-inspired pop music, I think artists should be able to do it, and it has validity in like the modern musical world. It's about how you approach it, because I think trying to replicate like an old sound and using all of the same lyrics and instruments and mixing techniques that they might have done in the 80s or 70s or whatever is like maybe pointless, because we can't lie to ourselves. We live in 2026, so why are we going to completely ignore the era that we're from to try and replicate something from there? We should, I mean, I think the artists who do it the best are the people who take things from both. I guess I try and do that with mixing techniques. I'm always trying to make the mix sound bigger than, because obviously in the 1960s, which is like probably my favorite era, 1960s, 1950s, that the mixes and the frequency spectrums were quite like thin, like it wouldn't be that high or that low, and it wouldn't become that loud. But I think you can use modern mixing techniques to make it bigger and just kind of amplify everything. And also recording techniques. I record everything alone with like looping basically. So I take a drum beat and often loop it round, or take samples and use them and cut them up, which is obviously not what they were able to do in the 60s or the 50s, because everything had to be played live, which I think that's also brilliant, but it's just not how I make music. What do you think? Do you think we should stop making music that sounds like it's from another era, or do you think we should do this more? See you in the next one.